All right, so you head to the doctor, right? And you're not feeling great. They're trying to work out what's going on. They've got to consider all the different possibilities, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's differential diagnosis, and it's really how medicine works.
For sure. Yeah. It's the real cornerstone of medical care.
But it's usually a pretty complex puzzle.
It is. It is. It really is. Like, you're trying to solve a mystery. You've got your symptoms, you've got your clues, and you're looking at them.
Yeah.
And then you're weighing all these different potential explanations. You have to kind of work through all of that to figure out what the most likely thing is.
Absolutely.
It's rarely just a simple one-step answer.
Now, what if there was a way to kind of bring in some new, powerful minds to help with that detective work? That's what we're digging into today on this deep dive. It's the world of LLMs, large language models, and how they might be able to help doctors with or even automate parts of this really critical diagnostic process.
It's exciting stuff. It really feels like we're on the edge of a really big development here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what we're going to be talking about today is one LLM in particular. It's called AMI, Articulate Medical Intelligence Explorer.
Okay.
And this has been designed specifically and trained for diagnostic reasoning in medicine.
And this isn't just theoretical stuff. What we're looking at today is based on a study that really put AMIE to the test. They were looking at how well it could generate these differential diagnoses.
Yes.
So these lists of potential diagnoses, both on its own and as a tool to help doctors, like in a real clinical setting.
Yes. And to make it even tougher, they used really difficult medical cases.
Yeah.
So these were taken from published case reports, including some particularly challenging ones from, the New England Journal of Medicine has these clinical pathological conferences, or CPCs. These are really interesting. They're like diagnostic puzzles.
Oh, wow.
Some really tough ones.
So they are using AME to work through these really hard cases, like basically seeing if it could help in a real medical mystery kind of situation. So what's the mission for today? It's really for us to understand how well AME performed in this really vital medical task. What did the results show about its abilities? And what could this mean for doctors, for patients like you in the future of healthcare? So let's kind of start breaking this down. How did they even go about figuring out what AME could do all on its own?
They took those really hard medical cases, just the text of the reports,
Okay.
fed that to Amy,
Right.
and basically said, okay, Amy, based on this, what do you think are the top 10 most likely diagnoses?
Okay.
Just like a doctor trying to work it out.
Like if it was a doctor kind of working on their own.
Just Amy, completely by itself.
So could this AI actually work as like a solo diagnostician? I mean, what did they find out?
What they found was really interesting. So Amy's standalone top 10 accuracy, that means the correct diagnosis was somewhere in its top 10 list, was 59.1%. Now, to give you an idea of how that stacks up, they also had human doctors look at the same cases without any help, no AI.
Right.
And their top 10 accuracy was only 33.6%.
Okay.
And that difference was statistically significant. What that means is that it's unlikely to be just a fluke.
Right.
So this is suggesting a real difference in their abilities on these challenging cases.
So just operating completely independently, AMIE was better at getting the right answer somewhere in its top 10 than an actual doctor.
Yeah, that's what the data's showing.
That's pretty surprising right off the bat.
It is. And to go a little deeper, AMI actually included the correct diagnosis somewhere in its list in 59% of the cases.
Okay.
And almost a third of the cases, 29%, it put that correct diagnosis as the most likely option, the top one.
Wow.
So again, better scores from AMIE working alone than the clinicians.
Okay. So it could get to the right answer in the mix, often is the top answer too. But it's not just about whether it pops up eventually. The whole list matters, right? Like how good that list is overall must matter too.
Oh, for sure. The researchers didn't just look at whether the right answer was there. They also looked at the quality of the list.
Okay.
So how relevant and well-supported AME's suggestions were, the appropriateness of those suggested diagnoses, how well they actually fit what was going on with the patient, and then how comprehensive it was. Did AME consider all the reasonable possibilities?
Right.
AME scored well in all of these areas. So the median quality score showed that the correct diagnosis was actually included, and it made sense within the list.
Okay.
And the median comprehensiveness score indicated that it was considering a good range of possibilities.
So it wasn't just like throwing out random guesses.
No, not at all.
It was actually putting together a logical list.
Yeah, it was thinking it through.
Okay. So AMIE was not just statistically better at including the right answer. It was generating these thoughtful and well-rounded lists. Now, we know that AI is advancing all the time. How did it compare to other cutting-edge models at the time of the study?
That's a really good question. The study actually compared AMIE's performance to GPT-4, which was one of the most advanced language models at the time they did these experiments.
Okay.
And it was interesting. GPT-4 may have had a bit of an edge in getting that single top diagnosis right, but AMIE did better when you looked at the top few suggestions, the top N, where N is greater than 1.
Okay. Right.
What that suggests is that AMI may have been making differential diagnoses that were overall higher quality, more comprehensive, so giving doctors a better range of possibilities to consider.
Okay, so AMI had some real strengths, even on its own.
Yeah.
But the study also looked at how it did when it was working with doctors, right? I think that's probably where things get really interesting for our listeners.
I agree. That's where the rubber really hits the road.
Yeah.
So they wanted to see how AMI could help a doctor diagnose.
Okay.
So they set up a scenario where doctors were given a tough case, and then they were randomly divided into two groups. One group had the usual medical resources that doctors typically use, things like search engines, textbooks, the standard tools.
Right, the tried and true.
Exactly. And then the other group had access to all of that, plus AM.
Okay, so it's a head-to-head, standard tools versus standard tools plus AME.
Exactly.
What did they find when they looked at how these two groups of doctors did?
Well, the big thing was that the doctors who were assisted by AME got a higher score for the quality of their differential diagnoses.
Okay.
Their accuracy within the top 10 was 51.7%.
Right.
That's significantly better than the standard resources group, who only had 36.1% accuracy.
Right.
It was also better than a separate group who only used search, which had 44.4% accuracy, and all those improvements statistically significant.
Wow, okay. So that's a real difference. It seems like having AMIO there did help doctors get to a more accurate list of potential diagnoses. But was it just about getting that right answer more often, or was it helping in other ways?
It was definitely helping in other ways. The study also showed that doctors using AMI generated more comprehensive differentials.
Right.
To put that in real terms, there were 73 cases where the doctors working without AMI at first didn't include the right diagnosis in their list at all.
Oh, wow.
But then after they got AMI's input, they added it.
Okay.
Compared to only 37 cases in the search group.
Right.
So AMI was broadening their thinking.
So it wasn't just nudging them in the right direction. It was helping them consider more possibilities that could be going on.
Exactly.
And as a future patient, that's a good thing. You don't want stuff to get missed, right?
Exactly. And the numbers back that up, too. The number of cases where that top diagnosis was actually the correct one was statistically higher for doctors using AMI.
Okay.
Their average score for how appropriate the diagnoses were was also significantly higher.
So better fit to the patient's situation.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And interestingly, those differentials tended to be longer when doctors were using AMI.
That makes sense, right? If you're considering a wider range of things.
Yeah, exactly. You've got more on the list.
Now, here's a practical question. Did using this new tool slow the doctors down?
Yeah.
Because time can be critical.
Absolutely. That's a really important consideration. Surprisingly, the time it took for them to come up with their differential was actually pretty similar, whether they were using AME or search engines.
Okay.
And this is even though the doctors were all very experienced with using search, but they were brand new to the AME interface. The researchers thought that using AME might take longer because of the learning curve.
Right, you'd think so.
But that wasn't the case.
That's so interesting. So AME offered a pretty big improvement in the quality of diagnosis without slowing them down,
Seems that way.
even when they were just starting out with it. Okay, we've seen the numbers, but what did the doctors think? Like, what was their actual feedback like? That's got to be really valuable.
It was. The study collected that feedback from the doctors who used AME, and they generally found the system easy to use and navigate. And their overall opinions were positive about its potential.
Okay.
A lot of them said they felt more confident in their final differentials after using it.
That feeling of confidence seems like a really important thing, especially when you're dealing with these tough cases.
Yeah, especially when there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah. Were there any specific things about using AME that they found helpful that really stood out to them?
One interesting thing they brought up was they compared it to using search engines. They said that when they weren't really sure where to start their search or how to narrow it down, they found that really difficult.
Yeah.
With search engines.
Right.
But they felt that AME was much easier to use in those situations. It gave them a more direct and intuitive way to look at the possibilities based on the patient's information.
That makes sense. Like, sometimes figuring out where to even begin is the hardest part. But the doctors weren't just taking everything AME said at face value, right? They're professionals. They must have had their own critical perspective.
Absolutely. They were excited about AMI's potential, but they were also very aware of the limitations of LLMs,
Yeah.
like the risk of what's called confabulation.
Okay.
That's when the AI makes stuff up, basically.
Okay.
It generates things that aren't accurate or don't really make sense medically.
Right.
And they were worried about that, especially if AMI was used by people who weren't trained doctors.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
You need that human expertise to really guide and interpret it. Were there any specific cases where it seemed to do really well, or maybe where it struggled a bit?
It seemed to be most helpful in cases that were kind of straightforward and had clear, specific keywords.
Okay.
Or what are called pathognomonic signs, which
Yeah.
are like really characteristic signs or symptoms that point towards a specific disease.
Okay, got it.
But some doctors noticed that in more complex cases, where you really had to understand a lot of different pieces of information and how they all fit together, AMI had a harder time.
Okay.
It might draw conclusions from just one symptom without seeing the bigger picture.
Right.
So it's really good at picking up on those strong, clear signals.
Yeah.
But maybe not so good at piecing together more subtle, complex stuff.
Yeah, and that's where the doctor's judgment is really important.
Exactly.
Now, the study also mentioned this idea of AIM potentially being able to upskill doctors. What do they mean by that?
They were talking about the idea that doctors, by using AMIE and seeing these wider possibilities it suggests, could actually learn from it
Okay.
and maybe broaden their own diagnostic skills.
Okay.
So especially doctors who are earlier in their careers or who work in areas where they might not have easy access to specialists,
Right.
it's like having a virtual mentor to bounce ideas off of.
Yeah, that's really cool. Like using it not just as a direct tool, but as a way to actually learn.
Exactly. It could be a huge asset in medical education.
But the interaction between a doctor and an AI like AMIE, it's not going to be perfect right away.
Yeah.
Were there any challenges or things that could affect how well that collaboration works?
Yeah, they did mention a few things. One is what's called anchoring bias, where a doctor might get stuck on their initial idea about what's going on, even if AME is suggesting other possibilities.
Okay.
There's also the potential for what they called LLM suggestibility, where the way a doctor asks AMI a question could kind of unintentionally steer it towards the wrong answer.
Right. So like leading questions.
Exactly. And then they talked about the importance of trust calibration. Doctors have to figure out how much they can trust AMI's suggestions, knowing when it might be less certain.
So knowing when to question it.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a really important part of this. It's not just about the technology, it's about how we interact with it.
Absolutely.
Now, like any good research, this study had some limitations. What were some key things to keep in mind when we're looking at these results?
Right. They mentioned a few. First, the cases they used to test AME were from the NEJM CPCs. Now, these are designed to be tricky. They're deliberately chosen to be like these diagnostic puzzles, often focused on really rare diagnoses.
Right.
And that might not be exactly like what doctors see every day in their practice with more common conditions.
So it did well on these really hard cases, but that doesn't necessarily mean it'll perform the same way on more routine stuff.
Exactly. And another thing was that in this study, AME could only see the text of the case reports. The doctors, though, had access to the full reports with images, lab results, all that extra data.
So visual information.
Exactly. Things that are often really important. We don't know how much better AME might do if it could see all that, too.
Right. That's a big difference. So AMIE was working with less information than the doctors.
Yeah, they also pointed out the need for consistent ways to evaluate these LLMs in medicine,
Okay.
and the importance of having good evaluation methods that involve both automated metrics and human judgment.
Makes sense. You need that expert perspective.
They also emphasized that this study was mostly about AME as a tool to assist doctors. We need to be careful about thinking of it as a replacement for doctors just yet.
So while AMIE doing its own thing was interesting, the main takeaway seems to be about its potential to help doctors make better diagnoses.
Exactly.
Okay. What else did they mention?
The need for more studies to really understand how LLMs like this can best support doctors in all sorts of different medical situations.
Okay.
They want to figure out the potential benefits and risks in specific contexts.
Right. Makes sense.
And they talked about the importance of research into how humans and AI interact in these settings,
Yeah.
how doctors need to be trained to use them, and how to make sure they're used fairly for all patients.
Yeah. So a lot of really important stuff to think about as this technology keeps developing.
Definitely.
So let's bring it all together. What's the main takeaway from all this?
Well, the big thing is that AMI shows a lot of promise as a tool to help doctors deal with those challenging cases, to generate those lists of potential diagnoses. And the study showed it could improve the accuracy, how comprehensive the list is, and how appropriate those suggestions are to the patient's situation.
And even though it did pretty well on its own, the evidence so far suggests that its real strength is in supporting and enhancing human expertise.
I agree. It seems that the biggest benefit right now is AMI acting as a partner to doctors, helping them consider more options and ultimately leading to better diagnoses for patients.
This research definitely opens up some exciting possibilities. It's not hard to imagine tools like AMI really changing how medical knowledge is used and empowering doctors in all sorts of ways.
Absolutely. It's really thought-provoking. How could AI like this actually reshape the way medicine is practiced? What role will patients play in this changing world? It brings up a lot of questions about balancing technological advancements with that crucial human element of clinical judgment.
Lots to think about as we move forward.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for breaking all of that down for us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's a really fascinating topic. I'm excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, me too. This is just the beginning.
Exactly.
Well, that's it for our deep dive today. Until next time.
See you then.
Bye.